All right, y'all. Welcome back to the show. It's Anti-War Radio, Chaos 959 in Austin, Texas. Streaming live worldwide on the internet at chaosradioaustin.org and at antiwar.com/radio. And our next guest on the show today is Daphne Eviatar. She is formerly with the Washington Independent and now is senior associate at Human Rights First. Welcome back to the show, Daphne. How are you doing?
Hi. Started a new job, just figuring out the technical difficulties here, but I think we got it all worked out.
Okay, so we don't need no legislation is the title of your latest blog entry here at humanrightsfirst.org/blog, and cross-posted at the Huffington Post. And this is extremely timely, of course, because today's Washington Post reports that a Justice Department task force has recommended that 50 Guantanamo detainees be held indefinitely. Now, what exactly does that mean? Does that mean that they get a military commission, or not even that? Daphne?
It means not even that. It means we can hold them indefinitely without trial. I mean, this is what George Bush said. This is what Dick Cheney said. We were all hoping that eventually the Obama administration would say, we're not going to do that. We're going to give people trial. But apparently that's not the case. I mean, they hinted earlier on that there might be a category of individuals that they thought was too dangerous to let go, but they couldn't try them. And I guess, most of us were hoping they wouldn't do that, and now they've announced that, well, at least the task force has recommended that they hold these 50 people indefinitely without trial. So it's basically more of what the last administration did.
Well, and also, somehow this got by me. I must have noticed it at the time or heard it at the time, but it didn't stick in my head until I read it again on Glenn Greenwald's blog today. And that is that Obama had announced in front of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution approximately a year ago, somewhere around there, in his dueling speeches with Dick Cheney, attacking him from the right so as to normalize his extreme position, that he was going to have Congress pass a law that would basically legalize indefinite detention. And apparently, since September, he's gone back on that and said, he doesn't need a law. He's already got the authorization to use force against whoever did 9/11. And that's all he needs. So that is the exact same position that David Addington and Dick Cheney took, right?
Right. That is exactly the same position. And, the courts have generally let them do that. Has generally let the administration detain people under the laws of war indefinitely without trial. The question is, who do they get to detain? And so when these people are detained indefinitely, the Supreme Court says they have a right to challenge it in the habeas corpus proceeding, which just means they get to go to court and say, okay, what evidence do you have that I'm an enemy combatant, or what we now call I guess the Obama administration renamed it an unprivileged enemy belligerent, which is basically the same thing. So now the government has to show they have some evidence against the person. And in 32 out of 40 cases, they haven't been able to show that. So that's why some people are up in arms and saying,
Are you there?
Yeah, I'm there.
Okay, right on. So let's see, where were we? We were talking about, you were saying that the guys at Guantanamo who have gotten a chance to go before a judge under a writ of habeas corpus, as decided must happen by the Supreme Court in the Boumediene decision, that 32 out of 41 of those, the courts have found that you've got nothing on this guy at all. And I guess the question is, when you have these different categories of detainees, where some of them get military commissions and some of them don't, some of them get a habeas corpus, some of them don't, some of them are going to be tried in New York and some of them aren't. And we're not just talking about the Bush administration treating Hamdi and Padilla and John Walker Lind and Abu, Musawi, and all those people differently and inconsistently. We're talking about kind of a fresh start on a brand new, completely inconsistent and confusing form of procedure here. I'm confused as I could be, Daphne.
Well, and you're highlighting a really important problem, which is, if they had evidence against these guys, they would take them to court, right? That's why they're doing that with KSM and the 9/11 defendants. We have evidence against these guys. So they're implicitly saying we don't have reliable evidence against these guys, because if we did, we could take them to a court. So by saying that, they're basically publicly saying, we're holding these guys indefinitely without evidence. And that's a really dangerous, I mean, even aside from the constitutional issues, the justice issues, that, we just shouldn't be that kind of a country issue. It's just a national security problem. You're telling the world we hold people indefinitely without trial, even though we don't have evidence against them. That's dangerous. That's what they use to recruit new jihadists. So I can't, it's hard to understand the logic of this decision.
It's almost hard for me to understand the logic of even appointing this justice task force to do these recommendations and make it so official. I mean, why wouldn't they just write up a memo or something? Do you know what their reasoning is, or their supposed reasoning behind isolating these 50 out of the 196 that are still there?
Well, we're not privy to the exact information that the task force looked at, but what we know is that the task force is looking at each individual case to try to decide what's the best thing to do. And all we can surmise is that they looked at the evidence in these 50 cases and found they didn't have enough to bring them to trial. But for some reason, maybe based on like some hearsay evidence or some sort of maybe evidence elicited through torture, the kind of things that are considered not reliable and therefore not admissible in court, they might have, believed maybe this guy's dangerous. We don't know, we can't prove it, but maybe he is. And on that basis, they seem to have decided we're going to keep holding him. And, look at the politics of this, which is that the Obama administration doesn't want to be seen as releasing 50 people that the Republicans are going to say, hey, these are terrorists. So there's a lot of politics behind this, and even though we don't know exactly what the task force looked at, we know that it was an individualized determination based on the evidence they have against each person.
Well, now, part of this, too, is that the Bush administration originally put the base at Cuba because it's a lawless zone. But American courts, at least the first time, I think it was the Ninth Circuit out in San Francisco or something, ruled against that back in 2004. And I think they've abandoned that position, right? I mean, the courts have forced them off of that position, that lawlessness is okay as long as it's in Cuba.
Right. No, they've said that even we have control over this base in Cuba, and so they do have some constitutional rights.
Mm-hmm. But so now they're saying, I guess, that Gitmo is just bad public relations with the orange jumpsuits and what have you, so they are now going to bring them to Illinois. But they're not applying the Constitution to them any more than before. They're just bringing Gitmo here.
Basically, I mean, there's the old problem that Congress isn't really letting them bring Gitmo here. So far, Congress has the appropriation of any funding that would allow the administration to bring them to Thompson, Illinois. So as much as the administration, they want to do that, it's not clear that's going to happen. But yeah, the idea is we're going to now hold people indefinitely without charge and without trial on the United States soil in a U.S. prison. And, arguably that's worse. Or it's not worse, but it's not very different.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so at this point, really, it could be in Illinois, it could be at Guantanamo Bay, it could be at Bagram in Afghanistan, or in a secret underground dungeon in Thailand at this point. It's the same difference, mostly. I guess if they're at Guantanamo, they get one writ of habeas corpus, and that's the difference. Yeah. Is that it?
That is the difference, and that's an important difference, because at Bagram, they don't. In Bagram, they don't have any right to take their case to court, even if they're held for 10 years without trial. And there's sort of there's a sort of a minimal review procedure, but it's not public. We don't really know what goes on in it. They don't have a right to a lawyer. They don't have a right to any sort of defense. So it's not considered very legitimate. So it makes a difference that they're at Guantanamo, at least because the court has said they have the right of habeas corpus. I mean, they have the right to challenge their detention in court. Eventually, it's taken 8 years for some of those guys to get that challenge.
Yeah, but it seems like when, as you said, 32 out of 41 times where these guys have gotten a writ of habeas corpus, and this is after hundreds have been released just by the military and the Bush administration before that.
Right.
But where they have had the judge say, no, release this guy, they're not being released. And that's because, why? The government is appealing the writ of habeas corpus? Is that how that works?
It's partly because the government has appealed, but mostly it's because the government has said we don't have any place to send them. So all the people from Yemen, for example, even if they've won their habeas corpus case, the government for the most part, has not released them. They've released a few, but hardly any. As you know, now the government's all worried about Yemen, and if we send people back to Yemen, they're going to become terrorists. So that's the thing. And as a result, the government's ignoring the court orders to say these people have to be freed. And there's, I think, about a dozen people who have been, and I don't know the number off the top of my head, I think it's about a dozen people who have been ordered freed by the court, but are still being held in prison at Guantanamo.
Well, and so tell me about this madness that you're writing about at humanrightsfirst.org/blog today. We don't need no legislation. These guys are saying that you're right, Daphne. All this lawless confusion and indefinite detention in this system is wrong. We need to pass a new law that'll make it all okay. Is that really the argument here?
Well, yes, some people are saying that. And, you know, the Brookings Institution put out this report.
The Brookings Institution.
Yeah. And
sorry, that's just funny to me. That entire organization is funny to me. But I'm sorry, please continue.
Well, it's interesting because the person who authored the report, the main author, is not even a lawyer, and he is talking about an analysis of the legal system and whether the judicial system is adequate to handle this problem of the habeas corpus cases and what rights people have and the government's right to detention. So I don't personally. I've had some problems with the legitimacy of their analysis, but NPR this morning, for example, National Public Radio did a big story sort of highlighting this particular report and suggesting that it means we need new legislation that Congress would pass to allow the government to hold people indefinitely without trial and without charge in the United States. And then we don't have to have all these complicated court decisions. And that's the implication of what they're saying. But in fact, if you look at it, any new legislation is going to end up in the courts anyway. And the courts have adequately, I mean, I don't know a lot of their decisions, but they have been figuring out under the laws of war and under the Constitution what the government has to hold people or not. And there's no reason to have new legislation that reinforces that right that's then just going to get challenged all over again.
Mm-hmm. Well, so this is kind of strange. Do you have any predictions about how which way we're headed with this? Because it seems like if it's all going to end up with the courts, I guess either Scalia says it's all okay or it's not. But if the Constitution means anything, then none of this is okay. It's all got to get struck down like McCain-Feingold eventually.
Yeah, well, the problem is the courts.
Does this see my sunny optimism?
Yeah, I don't. Honestly, I think if you look at the direction the court's been moving in, which tends to be more conservative than the public right now and tends to be more conservative than the administration, if I had to guess, I would guess I don't even want to guess. All I can say is I think that, so far the courts have upheld the government's right in a war to hold people who are combatants for the duration of the war. But here we have what's called a war on terror, which has no end. It has no geographic limitation. And that's where it's really not clear what's constitutional, what's not. And that's what the court ultimately decides. I mean, I don't want to predict how they're going to do it, but even if the law of war allows for indefinite detention during a war of combatants, it's not clear that these 50 people, for example, that the government wants to hold indefinitely, it's not clear they are combatants. And that's why a lot of them are submitting their habeas cases. And it's not clear that this is a war that constitutes that falls under the laws of war, because we call it a war, but it's an indefinite fight against terrorism. So it's a very complicated situation that ultimately does have to be left to the courts, kind of whether we like it or not. I don't think Congress is going to really come up with a better answer. Mm-hmm. It's a bad day for people who care about things like the Constitution and, international law and upholding basic liberties, because we just had a government that's suggesting it's going to start holding people without trial and with evidence. So it's kind of a bad day, and we're hoping it's going to get better and that somehow the courts will reverse some of this, but it's hard to say what's going to happen.
Could you please tell us all about Human Rights First?
Yes, Human Rights First is a human rights organization, as its name suggests. It used to be called the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights. It started about 25 years ago, and we advocate focusing on U.S. policy, trying to get the United States policy to take into consideration first human rights positions and just to be more mindful of the human rights implications of its national security policy. So the group I'm involved in is the Law and Security Group, and so we focus on national security, and so things like Guantanamo, and we are very much supportive of closing Guantanamo, having either tried or released, that sort of thing.
Right on. Well, if you don't do it, nobody will, so thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your interest, Scott. Really appreciate it.
Everybody, that's Daphne Eviatar. She's Senior Associate for Law and Security at humanrightsfirst.org. You can find We Don't Need No Legislation at humanrightsfirst.org/blog. And there's an incredible archive over at the Washington Independent of all kinds of great knowledge for you.